All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Valeriano Ramos with Everyday Democracy, and I want to welcome all of you to this special event, the Electoral College and its role in the presidential election. This event is made possible thanks to a grant from the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. It is part of our effort to inform and educate Connecticut voters about the importance of civic engagement and voting for sustaining and strengthening our community's civic life and democracy. As the presidential election looms near, just 5 days away, it is important that we understand the important role that the Electoral College plays in our presidential elections. And we're going to now show the agenda for this event. We're going to start with a quiz that's going to test our knowledge of the Electoral College. It's a very fun activity. We will also show a short video. And after that, I will be introducing the moderator for our panel, and he will in turn introduce our distinguished panelists. After that, we will have Q&A with the audience.
Very well done to the three of you, and thank you so much for playing our game. Val, I'll hand it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Zoya. Yes, as you can see, we have different levels of understanding of the Electoral College, and but there's much more that we can learn about. So at this point, I want to introduce my colleague Sandy Rodriguez, who will show a short video. And after that, I will be introducing our distinguished panelists. Sandy.
Thank you, Val, and nice to see everybody here. So we're going to just play a short video. It's a little shorter than 7 minutes. For those of you who don't know a lot about the Electoral College, especially in terms of its history and how it came to be. It's pretty entertaining. It's from the Bill of Rights Institute in Washington. And I've viewed the video a whole bunch of times, and I swear every time I see it, I learn something new. So I hope you find it as entertaining as informing as I did.
At this point, I'm pleased and honored to introduce the moderator of our panel, Professor Bilal Dabir Sakou. Professor Bilal Dabir Sakou is an associate professor of political science in Hilliard College at the University of Hartford. His research interests are race and politics, urban politics and campaigns, elections and voting behavior. Professor Sakou has published articles on social and political participation by African Americans and public attitudes towards quality and integrated education in Connecticut. Over the years, he has served on the boards of directors for a number of organizations working on democracy reforms and racial and economic justice. These include Northeast Action, Democracy Works, Connecticut Citizens Action Group, the Connecticut Center for a New Economy, and One Connecticut. He currently serves on the board of directors for the Connecticut Mirror and Open Communities Alliance. He is also the chair of the board of directors of Common Cause in Connecticut and a member of that organization's national governing board. Professor Sakou has also been a panelist and moderator at numerous events, including the Connecticut Civic Health Project's town hall meetings, Hartford Votes Vota Coalition's candidate forum events, and major conferences. I am very honored to introduce Professor Bilal Sakou, who will introduce our distinguished panelists. Thank you, Bilal.
Thanks a lot, Val. Thank you for you guys for putting this event together, and thank you for this really excellent panel that I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say. So let me introduce the panelists. The first one is a friend and colleague with Common Cause in Connecticut, Diana Evans. She is a professor of political science at Trinity College. Her research interests are in the US Congress, with a focus on pork barrel politics within Congress itself and congressional elections. Her book, Greasing the Wheel, Using Pork Barrel Projects to Build Majority Coalitions in Congress, won the American Political Science Association's 2005 Richard F. Fenno Prize for Best Book in Legislative Politics. Her current research is on the effect of pork barrel projects on congressional elections. Our second panelist is Ronald Shuren. He is an associate professor at the University of Connecticut School of Public Policy. He has held policy and administrative positions at the New Jersey Department of Education, the former U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and the City University of New York. From 1997 to 2008, he served as executive assistant to the president of the University of Connecticut and concurrently was executive secretary of the University Board of Trustees. He also has the distinction of being the only panelist who's actually been an elector. Edward Zielinski, JD, is a Morris and Anna Trackman Professor of Law at Yeshiva University, Cardozo School of Law. He is the author of The Origins of the Ownership Society and Taxing the Church. His articles have appeared in many publications. He has testified before Congress, most recently before subcommittees on the House Judiciary Subcommittee. So thank you to all of our wonderful panelists, and I'm looking forward to hearing this discussion. The video did a really good job of laying out some of the arguments for why the Electoral College was created, and also gave us a sense of the historical arguments behind the decision that the framers of the Constitution made. I also know that there are a couple of other issues that I think are worth exploring in more detail, perhaps, with this panel. And so what I'd like to do is start with this question. The President of the United States is not elected by popular vote, as we know. And many Americans believe that the Electoral College is flawed and that this method of indirect election makes the process undemocratic. So is an additional reason why there is an Electoral College is because the framers distrusted direct democracy. And why don't we start with Professor Evans on this question?
I think the answer to that question is yes. The framers did distrust direct democracy, although they did consider the direct election of the president. So they didn't totally rule it out. If I could speak to one additional reason, there are a number of reasons they landed on the Electoral College. They wanted Southern states to ratify the Constitution, and Southern states were afraid that because so much of their population consisted of enslaved peoples, that they would lose power in any kind of direct election. So the Electoral College was part of a compromise to allow them to protect their own power and slavery.
Right. And I want to explore that issue of slavery in a moment, but Professor Shuren, what are your thoughts about just how much the framers were actually distrustful of direct democracy?
They wanted to remove the election of the president by two steps. Initially, the states are given the authority to determine how electors are chosen, and in all the states, the state legislatures were choosing the electors. Only later, starting in about the 1820s, did there be popular vote for the electors. And as late as 1860, the state of South Carolina still chose its electors by the state legislature. So there was clearly a wariness about not allowing popular vote. James Madison is reported to have favored popular vote for the president, but his thoughts did not win the day.
Professor Zielinski, what do you think about this issue? Is he on mute?
I was mute. Okay. Zoom is our lives these days. I think it's true historically that the Electoral College reflected their concern about direct democracy. I also think it's clear that, like a great many other constitutional institutions, it has evolved in very different ways. The Senate we have today is different from their conception of the Senate. The House is different from their conception of the Senate. There was no such thing as presidential cabinet mentioned in the Constitution. So I think it's true historically, but I don't believe, frankly, that's terribly relevant to our debate today. How do we perceive this institution and its functions today?
Very good point. Professor Evans, you raised the issue about the Electoral College and its ties to slavery, and in particular the Three-Fifths Compromise. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more about just what advantage counting slaves, for example, gave the South when it came to electing presidents, for example?
Well, about 40% of the population of the South consisted of enslaved people, and in Virginia, it was about 60%. So obviously those people had no rights, including the right to vote. So if they had had a system based in any way on popular vote, the southern states would have lost out because their populations were not that large if you didn't count enslaved people. So the 3/5 compromise let them sort of have their cake and eat it too. For purposes of representation, they got a lot more representatives in the House of Representatives by counting those individuals. And that also gave them more votes in the Electoral College.
Absolutely. Professor Sharon, what do you have any thoughts about that issue as well?
Well, yes. I mean, this is one of the examples of the inherently undemocratic system that was initially developed. I do want to say that, little sidelight, state of Connecticut Constitution guaranteed the vote to white males. There was a proposal in about 1820 to delete the word white. That went to referendum. That referendum was defeated. In my part of the state, northeastern Connecticut, it carried, but the referendum was defeated. Just a little sidelight there.
Right. Professor Zielinski, I know that, one of the advantages that I think it was something like 6 or 7 of the first presidents out of 7 or 8 presidents were actually Southerners, and Virginia in particular benefited from the way in which this adding slaves in as a portion of the population occurred. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that history around the early presidents and coming from slaveholding states?
Well, I'll talk about the early history and then I'll talk about the later history. My own suspicion, and this is counterfactual, but I think that the Virginia presidents would have won a popular vote had there been such a thing. We'll never know the answer to that, but Virginia was a dominant state in a way that no other state has been since then. And I think it's very possible that George Washington in particular would have been the person selected in a popular vote. After all, he was elected unanimously. I also think it's very important to talk about the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution, because they are, in a very real sense, the way that these original sins were purged from the system. And it's interesting, the drafters of the 14th and 15th Amendments kept the Electoral College. I believe that's because those folks, including, for example, Lyman Trumbull, who had strong origins here in the state of Connecticut, I think that they believed, among other things, that by doing the abolition of the 3/5 rule, guaranteeing Black males, admittedly males, the vote, I think they believe that they were bringing the Congress and the Electoral College closer to our democratic ideals, which indeed I think they were.
Right. Now, the video talks about the role of federalism as being a sort of motivation for creating the Electoral College. And certainly there are people who argue today for the continuation of the Electoral College because they think it does, in fact, preserve American federalism in the sense that it allows for the division of power between the states and the national government, and allows for perhaps even greater diversity of interest to be represented in the presidential election. Let me actually come back to you, Professor Zielinski. Do you find that argument compelling, or do you agree with it or not?
I find it very compelling. Federalism is the second most important reason I'm in favor of the Electoral College. And all of us have learned the value of federalism in the last year. I mean, we haven't handled the COVID crisis very well. Think of how poorly it would have been handled had there not been governors and states in Ohio and Connecticut and New York who were able to respond. So I think that there's a new appreciation for federalism. And federalism, as I say, is the second most important reason for me for keeping the Electoral College.
Right. Professor Evans, do you think federalism is an important reason for preserving the Electoral College?
I certainly want to agree with Professor Zielinski that federalism is important, but I actually disagree that it's a good reason to keep the Electoral College, primarily because of the profound inequality of influence that the Electoral College produces. I mean, I can talk about it a little bit, but you know, you've got almost 40 million people in California, and what, about 500,000 people in Wyoming. Every vote in California is worth about, you know, every electoral vote is worth about 700,000 people, whereas in Wyoming it's about, you know, 119,000 or something. So I think that giving the states that kind of weight really denies the rights of individuals.
Right.
Right.
Professor Shuren, settle this argument here.
Well, I think that that's absolutely true in a technical sense. However, look at the history of past campaigns. Candidates don't go to Wyoming. They're willing to give up those 3 electoral votes, but they'll spend a ton of time in Ohio. And if it was in play in California, it gives the big states more power in that sense. It's an ironic way things have played out, but I think it has played out that way. The reason we don't see people in Connecticut, presidential candidates, except to raise money, is in part because we're considered a lock for the Democrats in recent years. Also, we're a pretty small state, but you'll see candidates going to our larger states and campaigning for special interest groups in those states and trying to win those.
Right. Well, Connecticut is certainly a small state, but a very wealthy state, which is part of the reason why the candidates make so many trips here. But you've also opened the door to, I think, an interesting question about the role in terms of how much emphasis is placed on the swing states because of the Electoral College. So let me come back to you with this sort of a broader question to get you to elaborate more on this. Is the current Electoral College system really skewed towards these swing states? And if so, how?
Yeah. Back in 2008, I was in Ohio for a conference, and I could not escape campaign commercials. And I'm into it, but I got to the point where I didn't want to hear anymore. There was so much emphasis on that state because Ohio was not only a swing state, but also a big state. Same is true this year. And you get to the kind of second level, if there's a key interest group in the swing state, that group has a vastly disproportionate amount of power. Classic example may be senior citizens in Florida, not to pick on a group that I'm now part of, but there are other examples as well. Now, that may be a good thing for democracy or a bad thing for democracy, but it is a thing. Right.
Professor Zielinski, is this emphasis on swing states that we often see during elections, is that a good thing or a bad thing for our democracy?
I'm not sure, but I do know that states have a lot of choices here, and I would urge that some states should make other choices. My home state of Nebraska is one of the states that has an allocation by congressional district, and my hometown of Omaha, where I grew up, is being visited by presidential candidates. Well, you know what? We in Connecticut could do the same thing. Maybe we should make ourselves a swing state. The folks in Colorado in 2004 rejected a constitutional amendment which would not have used the district by district system, but would have allocated all of Colorado's votes by a percentage of the total vote. Maybe we should do that in Connecticut. We want to presidential candidates, we can get them here. We've got choices.
And we're going to come back later when we talk a little bit about ways to perhaps reform or change the Electoral College. But Professor Evans, you know, and I know, as you know, teaching in Connecticut as we all do, it's kind of disappointing to not see much activity in the state. Some might argue that's a good thing. But from your perspective, is something lost with regard to how Connecticut voters are maybe motivated to participate because there's such little emphasis on Connecticut the way it is in a place like Ohio or Pennsylvania right now, or Florida?
Well, I think in the modern age of the internet, people are motivated to vote regardless of whether candidates come to the state or not. But in terms of, I think, you know, we might not get as much attention once someone has been elected because we didn't help them get elected. So I suppose that's one disadvantage for Connecticut. But I personally would rather see candidates going where the most people are. So I think that if we did away with the Electoral College, you'd see candidates going to Los Angeles, Houston, Dallas, but they're not going to California. They're not going to New York. They're not going to the big states for the most part. Only when they get competitive, like Texas, they're starting to, I mean, Texas is the second largest state in terms of electoral votes, and only now are they starting to get visits from candidates. So my feeling is if we value attention from candidates, it should be going where the people are.
Very good point. Since you guys are beginning to sort of play with some of the criticisms of the Electoral College and even some of the defenses of the Electoral College, let me ask more sort of directly your thoughts about that. And so just for a moment, I'm going to ask all three of you to put yourself, regardless of where you may be at on this, in the posture of actually defending the Electoral College. If you had to defend it, what would be your argument for defending the Electoral College today? And Professor Zielinski, let me start with you on this one first.
Well, I don't have to play at it because I am defending the Electoral College. And I defend the Electoral College for a very simple reason, and that is institutional reform should occur gradually. Institutional reform has unintended consequences. I suspect that there's a real possibility on Tuesday night that an awful lot of people who don't believe in the Electoral College are going to see some real benefits in the Electoral College. So as an institutional conservative, I think institutions should evolve slowly and carefully and should to avoid unintended consequences. And I make a final observation. This notion of a popular vote, this is not an American issue. Our friends to the north, Mr. Trudeau, he lost the popular vote. He's the prime minister. Twice in England in the 20th century, two of its great prime ministers, Winston Churchill, Harold Wilson, both lost the popular vote. Lots of electoral systems have other values than straight democracy. And I think we should change systems very cautiously and very carefully, because more often than not, there are unanticipated consequences for making radical changes.
Professor Shuren, you look like you want to say something on this question. So why don't you weigh in on this?
I don't want to attribute causality, but I will say concurrent with the existence of the Electoral College, we've had a Lincoln, we've had two Roosevelts, but we've also had some clunkers. So sometimes it's worked in producing what I think we would want, good leaders who are responsive to and accountable to the public. And sometimes it hasn't worked as well. Whether the Electoral College in and of itself had anything to do with that, I don't know. Maybe the convention nominating process has as much or more to do with it. I mean, a side point, you could say that the people of New Hampshire, a small state, have more to do with who gets to be president than any other state because of what goes on well before the general election. Couple of arguments for it. One, you know, candidates have a limited amount of time. If they wanted to spread themselves all over the country, they wouldn't get anywhere in depth. It does make campaigns possible. Sometimes candidates make wise decisions about their time and resources, maybe not wise, but it does make it possible. As I indicated, it may enhance interest group efficacy, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's a bad thing, but we can have our own opinions about that. And again, it does make federalism real in the sense of reminding us that we are a system of states.
Let me just sort of follow up. You mentioned interest group efficacy. Not everyone may know what you mean by that. Could you sort of?
Yeah, you know, a group of people, and let's take, it's up to people to decide whether these are good or bad. There are interest groups in white hats and interest groups in black hats. A group of senior citizens, a group of people of a particular ethnic origin, a group of people who love guns, a group of people who hate guns. All of those groups have a significant amount of influence in a particular state, more focused than perhaps their interest nationally. I use the example of senior citizens in a place like Florida. I'll use the example of people who are big gun advocates in a state like Montana, and that they are efficacious in the sense of having the ability to swing a state and give its electoral votes to a presidential candidate. And that's more important when they're in a big state.
Professor Evans, what's the best argument you think people can make for actually keeping the Electoral College or defending the Electoral College?
I can't think of one. I'm sorry, I can't put myself in their place. I think there are plenty of ways to preserve, there are plenty of provisions in the Constitution for preserving federalism without preserving the Electoral College. I think one person, one vote is a fundamental principle in the United States, and the Electoral College violates it in multiple ways. So
Right.
I can't play the devil's advocate on this one.
Well, let me turn it around then and give you the other end of that question then. If you're making a criticism of the Electoral College, give me your best case criticism of it.
Okay, well, the amount of influence that a state's voters have does not depend on turnout, regardless of how low the turnout is. A state gets the same number of electoral votes. Under almost any system other than a proportional popular vote system, the votes of people who voted for the loser in that state lose their vote entirely and actually get their vote converted to a vote for the winner. If you voted for Trump in Connecticut, your electoral votes were cast for Clinton, and the same is true in virtually every state. Well, really in every state. And finally, a popular vote loser obviously can become the president under an electoral college system. And I just think that's profoundly undemocratic.
But Professor Zielinski, I know that you are someone who believes in but you know, certainly there are criticisms out there. Do you find any of the criticisms of the Electoral College compelling in any particular way, or some semblance of truth that we should grapple with, you think?
Oh, no, I think that life is a complicated story. I think the most interesting thing is that the advocates of a popular vote never talk about 1960. I noticed in the memo, or rather the video, they didn't mention the 1960 election. And the 1960 election to me is the election where it was clear that the Electoral College was right. Professor Bennett, Dean Bennett, who in fact created the compact, it was his idea, has very clearly demonstrated that in fact Richard Nixon won the popular vote in 1960. John Kennedy was elected president, and he won decisively because of the Electoral College. I think in retrospect, that was a good outcome for the United States.
Professor Sharon, what are your thoughts?
Well, I guess somewhere along the way, we ought to talk about the faithless elector. There, you know, electors are elected. You run as a team when you go to the polls. If you haven't yet voted in Connecticut, you're going to be voting. You'll see at the top of the ballot, electors for Biden and Harris, or electors for Trump and Pence. You're not really voting for the candidate. You're voting for a team of electors. Well, in Connecticut, there's a law that says that you must vote for the person that you promised to vote for. If you're on that Biden team, you can't vote for Trump or Mickey Mouse or anybody else. It's not clear what the enforcement mechanism is, but not every state has such a law. And there have been in American history about 80 to 100 electors who didn't do what they promised to do. It never made the difference, thankfully, but it could someday. And we ought to think about that. You know, the founders thought that we were electing wise men, and it was men in those days who would use their wisdom to choose a president. But as somebody said, well, I want them to act, not to think. We want the electors to do what they promised to do. But if they don't, well, that's a problem.
But may I respond to that, Professor?
Go ahead.
The fact of the matter is that the bulk of those faithless electors occurred after a candidate died, Horace Greeley. And so, in fact, if we take that unusual situation away, there have been very few faithless.
Well, in fact, I did. It was 80 after that.
The Supreme Court's Chiafalo decision a couple of weeks ago ended this problem. Any state that wants to bind its electors and have a penalty can do it. That was the most rare thing, a 9-0 decision by this divided Supreme Court. So frankly, I think the faithless elector issue is off the table at this point. If a legislature doesn't respond to the Chiafalo opinion, it's irresponsible.
Right. Let me just for a moment return to Professor Shuren for a second. You're the only person among us who's actually been and electors. Maybe can you share a little bit about that experience with the audience so they'll have a sense of what that responsibility actually is?
I was nominated in a formal sense by the Democratic Convention in the state of Connecticut in 2012. By my request, I said it would give me a good story to tell my classes, and I swore on a stack of Bibles that I would do nothing other than vote for the Democratic nominees. We all knew it would be Barack Obama, but whoever the Democratic nominee was. So Obama carried the state. My team, myself and 6 others, were elected as electors. Come the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December, we went to the state capitol, the state Senate chamber, and with quite a bit of pageantry. There was an honor guard and there was a choral group, and we cast our ballot into a box that was carved, I was told, from the original charter oak tree in Connecticut, but they didn't leave much to chance. The ballots that we were given to cast were already filled in.
Professor Evans, clearly you're someone who feels like at least listening to you, you're someone who feels like the Electoral College needs to be fixed in some way. What are your ideas? How do you fix this system from your perspective?
Well, I don't like radical change either, because I think that it does produce unintended consequences. And I think that if we were to go to a direct popular vote for president, there are a few dangers. Certainly vote counting. The 1960 election is a great example in which you could have challenged, the Republicans could have challenged ballots in multiple counties. But that said, so that's an issue. But that said, you've got the additional problem of minor party candidates. So a direct popular election could provide for even smaller margins for the winning candidate than popular vote margins than we have now. So then you have to consider things like, well, do you want to have a runoff election like they do in some southern states? I mean, that system basically has racist origins, but that doesn't inherently make it a bad system. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is something that Ireland has actually, and other countries, is ranked choice voting, where if your first choice gets 1% of the overall vote, your vote for that person is dropped and your second choice gets the vote. So that's a complex system, but that's not to say that it couldn't be done. So yeah, I think the implications would have to be thought through very carefully. And that said, I don't think this is ever going to happen. But it's just what I would love to see.
Right. But Professor Shuren, go right ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting that the system asks people to make strategic choices. And I just saw the other day that Ralph Nader, Connecticut resident, said, well, I don't support Joe Biden, but I oppose Donald Trump. And what I want my followers to do is, if they live in a state that's going to be one way or the other, vote for the Green Party candidate. But if it's a close state, vote for Joe Biden. That was his perspective. Well, that's asking a fair amount of voters to kind of think all that through and play that strategic game. But if we had any system that was other than plurality winner in a direct popular vote, people would be asked to make certain kinds of choices.
Professor Zielinski, because you raised this issue, in 48 states, the candidate that wins the state's popular vote gets all of the electoral votes from the state. But in Nebraska and Maine, using the congressional district method, these states allocate 2 electoral votes to the state popular vote winner, and then 1 electoral vote to the popular vote winner in each congressional district. Should Connecticut adopt a similar kind of approach in your mind?
The answer is, I think it'd be great to experiment. I believe in experimentation as an important constitutional value. Even more importantly, I would like to see a red state and a blue state agree that in 2004, each of them offsetting each other will do that, so we can experiment. I'm not sure what the implications of doing this are. As I say, in my home state of Omaha, they saw Donald Trump a couple of days ago. That's a sign, and they may see Joe Biden, I've been told. I think to experiment in 2004 would be a good idea. I'm not sure what the results would be, but it would be good information for us to try it once.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I think President Trump actually visited a congressional district in Nebraska because he wanted that one particular vote, because if it's a close race, that one vote could really matter in the outcome of the election. Professor Shuren, you got your hand up. To say.
4 years ago, then candidate Trump went to Maine and did carry that second congressional district in Maine. So Maine went 3 votes for Clinton, 1 vote for Trump. And in 2008, Barack Obama had carried the Omaha district in Nebraska. It would be interesting because people in Connecticut now has an entirely Democratic congressional delegation, but the 5th district is kind of a swing district. It's easy to imagine the Republicans carrying that district, and they would get at least 1 electoral vote from Connecticut as opposed to 0. So yeah, give it a try, see what happens.
I know we'll be going to question and answer in a moment, so definitely, folks, get in some questions through the chat. Professor Evans, I want to return to you for just a moment on this question, and you can answer about the congressional district proposal as well. But I'm also interested in whether you think something like the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is a reform that could possibly be used and could be effective. Because Connecticut is a part of that already.
Yeah. Here's my worry about that. Well, shall I just explain what it is?
Yes, go right ahead,
for people who aren't familiar with it. This is something that has been passed by state law in a number of states, almost all Democratic states, I'll say, that compels the electors in that state to cast their votes for whoever wins the national popular vote, regardless of whether that person won the state's popular vote. It seems like a workaround to make sure that the national popular vote winner would win. And by the way, it would not take effect until enough states to equal 270 electoral votes enacted the law. My worry about it is it's not a constitutional amendment, and a state could be like Lucy with the football in Peanuts, the very last second say, oh, we don't like the way this came out, and rescind their participation in the system. And then that starts a chain reaction. So to me, unless there's something about it I don't understand, it seems kind of flawed, fundamentally flawed.
Okay. Professor Zielinski, what are your thoughts about the National Interstate Compact that Connecticut is a part of? Is that something that you also think is flawed as well?
I'm strongly opposed to it. And I have to say, the person who invented the idea, Dean Bob Bennett of Northwestern, is a friend. I taught with him at Cardozo. We had many lunches discussing this. I think it's a very flawed idea. And I just raised the following prospects to someone who believes in this system, as well as a popular vote. What would prevent a state in the compact from reducing its voting age to 12 in order to maximize its influence under the compact? The answer is nothing. That's also true in a direct vote. Well, then we're going to have federal standards to have the federal government intervening more deeply into our elections. And I really ask a lot of my friends whether in the year 2020, having a presidentially appointed Secretary of Elections looks like a very good idea to you.
Right. Professor Shuren, any thoughts about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact?
It is hard for me to imagine, say, in Connecticut, electing 7 electors who, let us say, Donald Trump surprisingly carried the popular vote nationally. Those 7 Democratic electors obeying the law as they would be required to do and voting for Donald Trump. But maybe they would. People act in obedience to the law when they don't like it all the time. That could happen. The idea of each state trying to rig the process to get more, I suppose, more popular votes in, well, I guess anything's possible. Our long history in the United States of letting states determine pretty much on their own who gets to vote was not a happy history. And to the extent the federal government got involved through the 15th Amendment and through the amendment that guaranteed the 18-year-old vote and through other amendments that created the possibility for the states to, for the federal government to guarantee equal protection of the laws in the voting process, I think there's some justification for getting the federal government more involved.
Okay, right. I know Zoya has been following questions in the chat, and so I want to invite her in to tell us about some of the questions we're getting from the audience.
Thanks, Bilal. So we have our first question from Mary DeLeo. Thank you, Mary. They ask, can the speakers explain how Maine and Nebraska handle their electoral college votes and maybe speak to their opinions on that process?
Why don't we start with Professor Zielinski on that question?
Yes, what happens in those states is that the Secretary of State makes the determination of the presidential vote in each of the respective districts. The winner in that district, his elector or her elector, is then picked. They then take the overall statewide vote, and then there are two so-called senatorial electors who are then picked. Those are then the electors. And by the way, the Electoral College never meets. It was never intended to be a deliberative body. Those are the electors who then meet in their state capital. There are 51 different meetings. And then those electors cast the ballots, which in turn the Secretary of State and ultimately the governor then certifies to the Vice President of the United States in his capacity as the President of the Senate. So from their perspective, the process is the same in December. The only difference is the count of the electors occurs on a district basis, with two of the senatorial electors being done on a statewide basis.
Okay, thanks. Any sort of comments you'd make, either Professor Evans or Sharon, on that specific question? I mean, it's a very informative way of understanding the process.
I would just say, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Ron.
The states mostly went to a winner-take-all system starting in about the 1830s because it gave them more clout, or so they thought. Prior to that, electors were elected in different ways and sometimes individually, but I could see where for a big state, they would not want to give up that clout. There was a move in Pennsylvania a few years ago to go to a district by district system with the Republican legislators pushing for that. Democrats were appalled because they thought that this would badly hurt their chances of carrying Pennsylvania, as it turned out they didn't in the last election, but hurt their chance of carrying Pennsylvania with its nice slew of electoral votes.
Professor Evans, go right ahead.
Now I do have something to add. Since if we're talking about making that change to district by district electoral votes, Congress is very heavily gerrymandered by party, so that the district by district or congressional district plan like Maine and Nebraska has would not produce a terribly different outcome, and certainly would bias the results toward the majority party. The website 270 to Win modeled out what would have happened in the last two presidential elections if all states had the same system as Maine and Nebraska. And if that had been the case, Trump would have gotten 15 fewer electoral votes, but he still would have gotten 290. However, in 2012, Romney would have won. Romney would have gotten 274 votes.
He was electing a Republican House.
I think, yeah, I think this is a, this is a be careful what you wish for kind of thing if you're trying to overcome a minority president.
Interesting. Zoya, do you have another question for us?
I do. The chat is actually blowing up with questions. So thank you to all who have been submitting them. And I encourage the rest of you, please keep entering your questions in the chat and we'll try and get to all of them as soon as we can. From Kay Keller, Kay asks, what would be the impact of gerrymandering in the proportional vote, such as in Maine and Nebraska? I can see that skewing the results even more.
Professor Shuren, you seem to nod affirmatively
Yeah,
on that.
well, as Professor Evans suggested, the impact would be to perhaps have a minority victory. You know, the gerrymandering problem is a major problem in terms of the Congress that's elected. Let's not make it a problem in terms of the president that's elected as well.
Professor Zielinski, are you concerned about the gerrymandering question as well?
In general, I'm not as concerned about gerrymandering as some other people, but let me make the point that there is really two forms that a proportional system can take. One is a district by district, and I think it'd be great if a red state and a blue state both agreed simultaneously to experiment with that in 2024. It's also the case that the proposal that Colorado's voters rejected would not have been on a district by district basis. The proposal in Colorado, which I wish they had passed, would have taken the entire slate, both those attributable to the House and those to the Senate, and then divided them in accordance with the statewide vote. So there wouldn't have been any gerrymandering. And again, that is an experiment I'd like to see a couple of states experiment with and get some data.
Professor Evans, I know you weighed in this earlier, but is there anything you would sort of bookend on that sort of conversation for that question?
Yeah, I think I do think that would be an improvement. But just to add a little wrinkle to that, this was one of the scenarios that was modeled in this article. If that had been done in 2016, neither candidate would have gotten a majority, and the election would have gone to the House of Representatives, where each state gets one vote, which is, very undemocratic. So, and of course that result is because in some states, minority party candidates got enough votes to deprive, to gain one electoral vote in those states. So again, I think the worst case scenario is having it go to the House of Representatives in terms of democracy. So I'm a little ambivalent. The problem always minority candidates are an issue, and just they have different implications in different electoral systems.
Professor Shuren, you look like you were ready to jump in very quickly before we get to the next question. Go
Just
right
a little, I've read that some of the people at the Constitutional Convention actually thought that the Electoral College would kind of be sort of a nominating committee, picking the top 5 and later the top 3, and then that the Congress would indeed choose the president. That was probably an idiosyncratic view, but I think that there were some people who thought that would happen. Of course, it's only happened twice.
Right, yeah. Zoya, next question.
So next question, the Electoral College could be described as a constitutional hangover. If you were able to abolish the Electoral College and start again with the election of a president, how would you do it?
Professor Evans, why don't we start with you and then start with you first. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I sort of already answered that question. Popular vote with a possible runoff or ranked choice voting.
All right. Well, let me ask then, Professor Zielinski, and I know you're comfortable with the system that's in place, but if there was a way to start this process over with, how might you have done this at the very beginning?
Well, I'm very much afraid of saying, how would you start from scratch? Because if we started from scratch, the American people would not approve the Bill of Rights. So I think we ought to be very careful when we talk about constitutional hangovers. Some of these hangovers look pretty good to me. I have no doubt that if we were starting from scratch, we would do popular vote, but we're not starting from scratch. Political systems and legal systems shouldn't start from scratch. We learned that from our friends in France 200 years ago.
Professor Shuren, any thoughts on that issue of starting from scratch?
I have to admit, I don't have a strong enough imagination to come up with anything other than a direct popular vote.
Right.
With some provision for assuring that somebody not be elected with a small plurality. In New York City, for example, you need to get 40%, not 50, in a Democratic primary. Well, something like that. Otherwise, there's a runoff.
Yeah, and certainly there are some folks out there who argue for an Article 5 Constitution in order in order to actually redo perhaps the entire Constitution. And that makes a lot of people nervous at that idea. Professor Zielinski, you got your finger up, go ahead.
Under a 40% rule, Abe Lincoln lost in 1860.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. Zoya, next question.
Next question, from Mark Detty, is there a benefit or a risk of having an electoral college given the current world of foreign influence, perhaps from Russia or China?
Interesting question. Professor Shern, how do we start with you on this one? Any reaction to that question?
Well, if people have evil intent now, they can focus on the swing states, which probably makes it a little easier to exercise their influence. So I suppose that the Electoral College is one of our creates one of our weaker spots. But this is a problem that far goes beyond our Electoral College. So we need to think about it from many dimensions.
Any reaction to that question, either Professor Zielinski or Professor Evans?
Yes, I agree. I think the problem of foreign interference in 2016 and today is it goes beyond contours of the Electoral College.
Right. I agree. I agree with that.
All right. Zoya, another question for us.
Thomas Sikowski asks, do you think that the Interstate Popular Vote Compact violates the Constitution itself?
Let's start with Professor Zielinski on this one.
The answer is no. I think it's unwise, but I think that the states have the right to allocate their electoral votes as they see fit. So my friend Bob Bennett convinced me it's constitutional to have the compact. He didn't convince me that it was wise.
I have a question for Professor Zielinski, and I honestly don't know the answer to this. Must a compact of that nature, an interstate compact, get congressional approval?
Simple answer is we don't know. The court has distinguished between those compacts which do require congressional approval and those which don't. Good arguments either side, but the fact that they're good arguments on either side, I think, is another argument why we shouldn't have the compact.
But doesn't ultimately the states themselves get to determine how the electors will actually vote? So is that really a congressional question?
Well, that's the point.
Okay.
Meant that it's constitutional and why I ultimately concluded that it is constitutional. Right. Which compacts between states require congressional approval and which are sufficiently ministerial that they don't? That's a very complicated and unclear question of constitutional law. But on balance, I think this compact is constitutional because the states have the right to allocate their congressional district, their electoral districts as they want.
Right. And Professor Evans, unless you have a comment on that, I'd like to move to the next question. So why don't we go to the next question from Zoya?
So Jen Griffith asked a question also about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, but I'm going to move on to the following question because I think we've covered that. From Sam Berg asked, with this current election, there is a lot up in the air over mail-in ballots, voter suppression, and the amount of time it will take to know who will win the election. Will the Electoral College be able to protect our democracy this year or become part of the problem?
Wow, interesting question. Professor Evans, I saw your eyes roll a little bit on that question. What do you
Yeah, there is a deadline, a congressional deadline for when the election has to be certified so that the Electoral College can vote by its legal deadline of what is it, December, I forget what date it is, but in December.
Monday after the second Wednesday.
Right, so it's 11th or something like that. So in some ways, the those deadlines could mean that there's a legal basis, as there was in 2000, for stopping vote counting, so that those deadlines can be met.
Right. What, Professor Zielinski, any thoughts about that particular question and meeting that deadline with the absentee ballots and all of the potential court cases that we may see occur after the election?
I'm going to go out on the limb here and make a prediction. A lot of people have said, what year is this going to be like? I think it's going to be like 1960. I think that the Electoral College is going to help secure an early victory for Joe Biden when he carries the states. And I think an awful lot of people who today don't like the Electoral College, I think at 3 o'clock in the morning on the election are going to see real advantages they don't.
Professor Shuren, are we all going to become lovers of the Electoral College, despite what may occur after the election?
My fear is that it will not be as a blowout for Joe Biden, and that there will be a couple of states, big states, that have disputes over the counting of absentee ballots. And those disputes, how things play out, will determine the winner of the election, and that there will be much litigation and much concern. And so I don't know how this is going to work, and I'm not sure that the Electoral College system will protect us. I would like to think that it would.
Zoya, another question for us.
No more questions from the chat at the moment. I do encourage everyone to keep submitting their questions. Professor Sekou, do you have any?
Yeah, actually, I do. And this conversation has sort of sparked in my mind, at least, something about the sort of partisan battles that go on around the Electoral College itself. And it makes me sort of wonder, do either of the political parties perhaps, are they favored by this current system that maybe makes it so difficult to even sort of tinker with it a little bit to try to deal with some of the sort of concerns that many in the public have? And so I guess the question is, to be succinct about it, is the current Electoral College system skewed toward either of the political parties today? And why don't we start with Professor Evans on that question?
Well, currently it's certainly skewed to the Republican Party because it's been a long time since Republicans have gotten even a plurality of the vote in a presidential election. I think the last time was 2004, but since 1992, that's the only time Republicans have won the popular vote. And yet they've taken the presidency twice during that time period. So
right.
Pretty clear currently.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that question, Professor Zielinski?
Yes, I think it's very important to think of these things in terms of the long time horizon. Yes, the last two presidents who carried the electoral vote while losing the popular vote were Republicans. The one before that was Jack Kennedy in 1960. Things change and institutions change, in the same way that Citizens United, we were told that as a result of Citizens United, Donald Trump was going to swamp the Democratic candidate with outside money. It's not happening that way. Citizens United is helping Joe Biden. I've got lots of friends who don't believe in employee unionism. Suddenly, now that they're protecting police, they see the benefits of employee unionism. I just think we ought to stand back, and if we're going to think about institutions, understand that in the great scheme of things, the wheel turns. Yes, the last two presidents who benefited from the Electoral College have been Republicans. My prediction to you on Tuesday, the beneficiary of the Electoral College is going to be a Democrat.
Professor Shuren, your thoughts about that question, about the
Of course, now the Rocky Mountain states and some of the Midwestern states, sparsely populated, have those 2 extra electoral votes because of their senators, and that's what's been giving them an advantage, and it helped George W. Bush and it helped Donald Trump. That said, some small states are Democratic: Vermont, Rhode Island, Maine. And so it could play different ways, but right now it favors the Republicans. When there was a move in the 1970s and 1960s to abolish the Electoral College, Senator Birch Bayh, Democrat of Indiana, was kind of leading that move. His big opposition came from many Republicans, but Richard Nixon, president, said, well, he would consider that, supporting that, although as president he wouldn't have a role in that. So it goes different ways.
Yeah. And I'm sort of thinking, I know Zoya, there was a question that popped up, I guess, the last question in the chat, and it's actually connected to what I wanted to sort of end with. So maybe I can sort of ask the question this way, because I think you guys are absolutely right. When you say it favors Republicans, perhaps, what it also does is that it favors small, mostly rural, mostly white, mostly conservative states, right? When we talk about Republican states, especially states like Wyoming, for example. And so the question really is about, how does the Electoral College perhaps perpetuate some of the problems we have along the lines of race, for example, in our society and other sort of systems of oppression, just thinking about the question that's in the chat itself? And Professor, since we've got you up there, Professor Shuren, why don't you start with an answer to that question?
Well, a couple of things. One is, let us remember the District of Columbia and some other left-leaning states have disproportionate clout in the Electoral College because of the way it's structured. So that's one part of it. Second, because minority groups can have disproportionate power in big states, or proportionate power, I should say, appeals to their support might be perceived as effective by candidates and thus might help attain objectives that are supported by minority groups. And so it could play varying different ways. You see now, I picked on the state of Florida. The Latinx population in Florida is being very much appealed to by both candidates trying to win the state of Florida. And you see such things elsewhere as well.
Right. Professor Zielinski, in terms of that question itself, any sort of thoughts from you about the way in which the Electoral College and our sort of challenges around the issue of race in our societies, that it's affected by the way in which we elect our presidents?
Yes, my teacher of constitutional law many, many years ago, Alex Bickel, always defended the Electoral College on the grounds that it helped minorities in urban areas. And I think that's right. I think that minorities in urban areas, African American, I know because I'm hearing from them, these guys are showing up at synagogues in Ohio and Michigan and in Pennsylvania. They're not showing up at the synagogues in New York and in Connecticut. So yes, I believe Alexander Bickel was right that the net effect of emphasizing the large swing states tends to help the minorities in those states. And then I think they exercise what might be called a virtual representation for the members of their communities in other states.
So Professor Evans, you get the last sort of thought on this.
Well, if you want to talk about this outcome by outcome, as opposed to in a structural sense, I would say that the answer to that question is no. I don't think that this last 4 years has been helpful to minorities. So I think that Republican bias in the Electoral College, to the extent that, Republicans are less likely to be concerned with minority rights, at the moment, I would have to say it's not helpful.
Right. Well, it's good to be a part of and to listen to a panel that always agrees on everything. So with that in mind, let me turn it over to Val to close us out.
Okay, thank you, Bilal. As you all agree, I must agree, we had a really fantastic panel. This is a very complex issue, but I think we all agreed that the four of you really laid out some of the really important issues and sort of explain, I think, a lot of these concepts that I think will help us understand better what the Electoral College is. And so we encourage you to continue, all of you in the audience, to think about this and to do reading on this important subject matter. At this point, as we conclude, I want to ask that we all please thank Professor Sekou, Professor Zielinski, Professor Evans, and Professor Shuren for a great panel discussion. Thank you. Thank you so much. And before we adjourn, I want to again thank the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving for supporting this program. I want to thank also our co-sponsor, Hartford Votes Vota Coalition, and the coalition members who were part of the planning team for this event, Richard Frieder, our colleague who took the lead on it, Tanya Smith, Angela Bellas, Taryn Lopke of Common Cause, and Joe Barber of Trinity College as well. I also want to thank my colleagues at Everyday Democracy, Sandy, Zoya, Agnes, and Elena, for their important roles in planning this event. And lastly, I want to thank all of you for participating. And also, I want to ask you for a big favor. In the chat room, you'll find a link to a short survey that we would like for all of you to complete online. It will take less than 5 minutes to fill it out, and it will also help us gauge what you all learned and gained from participating in this event. So please click the link now. It will take a few minutes. And while you do that, I also want to encourage those of you who are not Connecticut Civic Ambassadors and would like to learn more about how you can become one, to click the link in the chat room that appears right after the survey link. That will take you to the website of Everyday Democracy, and there's a lot of information about becoming a Connecticut Civic Ambassador, and also an online membership form. And also, I want to announce the next event is going to be beyond Election Day, renewing our culture of civic engagement, with author Andrew Summers on Thursday, December 3rd at 3:30 p.m. on Zoom. So once again, thank you to our great, outstanding panel, Professor Bilal Sekou, thank you, Professor Sharon, Professor Zielinski, and Professor Evans, and also all of you for participating. Stay safe and healthy. And if you haven't already done so, please vote by or on Election Day, next Tuesday, November 3rd. Once again, thank you all for participating. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And thanks to Zoya and Val and also Sandra.